Before capture, before transport ships carried them across the Atlantic, most German soldiers carried in their minds an image of America carefully constructed by propaganda. Nazi broadcasts, newspapers, and officers' briefings repeated the same refrain. The United States was a land of weak men and indulgent women, a society too soft to endure hardship, too decadent to fight with discipline. To the average Wehrmacht officer or soldier, this portrayal became truth, reinforced daily by the echo chamber of state-controlled information. They were told that Americans spent their time in jazz clubs instead of in training, that factories built frivolous luxuries instead of war machines, and that soldiers in the US Army could barely function without comforts. In this worldview, the Reich's iron discipline and martial spirit guaranteed superiority. The enemy might have numbers, but those numbers would collapse under pressure. Even the material wealth of America was twisted into a weakness. Radios blared speeches warning that abundance made a people spoiled, unable to fight with the hunger and desperation of Germans defending their homeland. According to official doctrine, American plenty would only fuel cowardice. To young men raised on scarcity and sacrifice, the idea was strangely believable. By the time these soldiers marched into North Africa or France, they carried with them not just rifles, but an arrogant certainty that the Reich stood above a hollow empire of consumers. This arrogance shaped every thought, every assumption. Victory seemed not just possible but inevitable, because how could such a decadent society resist the hardened steel of the Wehrmacht? What they could not know, what they would only discover as prisoners, was how dangerously false those assumptions were. The propaganda that painted America as weak found fertile ground, because early German victories seemed to confirm it. In France, the Wehrmacht had swept aside one of Europe's most respected armies in just 6 weeks. Soldiers who marched under the Arc de Triomphe in 1940 believed they had witnessed proof of their nation's destiny. The ease of victory, compared with the stalemate of the First World War, felt like living history rewritten in their favor. In the Balkans, too, success came quickly. German columns thundered through Yugoslavia and Greece, defeating armies that crumbled under the momentum of blitzkrieg. For the average officer, these campaigns became tangible evidence that German discipline and technology outclassed any opponent. Every conquered capital deepened the conviction that the Reich's enemies were brittle, unprepared, and destined to fall. North Africa carried the myth even further. Under the command of Erwin Rommel, the vaunted Desert Fox, German and Italian units pushed British forces back across the sands. Tales of daring raids and swift armored thrusts filled soldiers with pride. Even when resources ran short, victories against larger forces reinforced the belief that skill and spirit mattered more than material supplies. For men shaped by these experiences, the Reich's superiority felt proven. Each triumph seemed to silence any doubt about Nazi claims of destiny. When they looked westward, toward America, it was easy to dismiss that distant nation as just another opponent doomed to collapse. Their confidence was not abstract. It was rooted in the victories they had lived through, victories that seemed to make the Reich unstoppable. When capture finally came, many German soldiers braced themselves for the worst. They expected harsh marches, crowded boxcars, or brutal conditions, the kind of treatment they had seen inflicted on prisoners elsewhere in Europe. Instead, their first journey into captivity in America left them stunned. From the moment they boarded, surprises unsettled their expectations. The train cars were not cattle wagons but passenger coaches with padded seats. Windows let in sunlight, and the compartments were clean. For men used to shortages and hardship, this alone felt bewildering. The shock deepened when they discovered a dining car. Their American staff served meals on proper plates, with bread, butter, and coffee. For soldiers conditioned to ration crumbs and thin soup, the sight was almost dreamlike. Some whispered that it must be a trick, a temporary gesture to lower their guard. Others sat stiffly, unsure how to respond. Yet as the hours passed, the comfort remained real. Guards were present, but they were not threatening. The prisoners were not shoved or cursed, but treated with a strange sense of routine. The train rolled smoothly through the countryside, carrying them deeper into a world they did not understand. Each mile challenged their assumptions about an enemy they had believed decadent and cruel. This was not the America they had imagined through propaganda. This was something different, something disorienting. For the first time, many felt a quiet confusion nor at the confidence they had once carried. If even captivity began like this, what else about America might prove completely different from what they had been told? As night fell, the train carried its uneasy passengers through landscapes unlike anything they had known during the war. Pressed against the windows, German prisoners stared in disbelief. Town after town appeared along the tracks, glowing with light. Streets were illuminated, shop windows shone, and homes radiated a steady warmth that pierced the darkness. For men whose families endured nightly blackouts under Allied bombing raids, the sight was staggering. In Germany, darkness had become a way of life. Entire cities vanished into shadow to avoid attracting enemy aircraft. Families lived with shuttered windows, dim lamps, and the ever-present fear of sudden attack. The contrast with America was almost unbearable. Here was a nation so confident in its security, so untouched by destruction, that it could blaze with light even in wartime. Some POWs whispered in awe, others fell silent, their thoughts carried back to wives and children sitting in cold, dark rooms across the Atlantic. It was not just the abundance of electricity that stunned them, it was the normalcy. Children played on lit porches, couples strolled along bright sidewalks, and theaters glowed with neon signs. This was civilian life as they had not seen it in years, perhaps ever. For men who had been told that America was weak and decadent, the illuminated towns carried a different message: strength, stability, and a sense of safety that Germany could no longer provide. The disbelief in their eyes was more than surprise. It was the dawning realization that they were looking at a world their nation could not match. For the German prisoners, the first true glimpse of America's industrial muscle came in the form of a single, almost unbelievable number. In camp briefings or whispered by guards who spoke casually of it, they learned about Liberty ships, massive cargo vessels built not in months, but in mere days. At first, many dismissed the claim outright. In Germany, constructing such a ship required long months of planning, assembly, and scarce materials. The idea that an entire ocean-going vessel could be launched in under a week seemed absurd, like a taunt meant to demoralize them. But soon the stories piled up. Shipyards that stretched farther than the eye could see, cranes swinging like mechanical giants, welders working day and night in shifts that never paused. The numbers became impossible to ignore. Hundreds of Liberty ships launched each year, each one capable of carrying thousands of tons of supplies. For men who had watched German tanks grind to a halt for lack of fuel or spare parts, the realization struck like a hammer. It was not just the speed of construction that stunned them, but the casual scale of it. America could afford to treat ships as disposable tools. If one was sunk, another could be built within days to take its place. To Germans trained to conserve every bullet and recycle every scrap of metal, this abundance was incomprehensible. In quiet conversations behind camp fences, officers admitted what none would have dared voice in the Reich. If these numbers were true, then the war was already unwinnable. America's factories, not Germany's divisions, would decide the outcome. The stunned realization left them shaken. What they once thought impossible was now the undeniable truth. America could outbuild them faster than they could fight. If the Liberty ships were difficult to believe, the ports that produced and serviced them were overwhelming beyond description. German POWs heard stories and sometimes saw photographs of harbors that looked less like docks and more like cities of steel. Towering cranes loomed over the water, swinging effortlessly to lift cargo that would have taken entire battalions of men to move by hand. Miles of warehouses stood in neat lines, their doors open to endless rows of trucks waiting to haul goods inland. The scale was almost cinematic, a vision too vast for men used to cramped German shipyards and rationed materials. Here was a system that seemed to operate like clockwork. Trains rolled in carrying coal, steel, and grain. Ships loaded with weapons, fuel, and food sailed out. At night the work did not stop. Floodlights bathed the yards in artificial daylight, and shifts rotated without pause, ensuring that production never slowed. For the Germans it was a sight that felt less like industry and more like a force of nature. They had been told that America was a country of soft workers, distracted by luxuries. Instead, they were confronted with evidence of a machine that dwarfed anything their nation could build. The endless supply chains revealed a truth their propaganda had hidden. America could move mountains, not just once, but again and again until sheer weight of production crushed every opponent. The feeling that spread among them was not just awe but a heavy, lingering curiosity. How could any nation compete with this? The moment came in the simplest way possible. A guard passing by with a crate tossed bottles of Coca-Cola toward the weary German prisoner. The men caught them awkwardly, staring at the dark liquid inside the glass, unsure if it was a trick or some strange medicine. For most it was the first time they had ever seen the drink up close. In Germany, Coca-Cola had been a rare curiosity before the war, available only in limited quantities and then cut off almost completely once the fighting began. Many POWs had only heard of it in whispers, dismissed as a sugary distraction for a decadent society. To now hold a bottle in their own hands, given freely, and to prisoners no less, was a jarring shock. Some hesitated to drink, but curiosity overcame them. The hiss of the cap, the fizz that leapt to the surface, and then the first cold taste. It was unlike anything they had ever known. Sweet, sharp, and refreshing, it clashed with the bitter rations they had grown used to. The sensation was both physical and emotional. It wasn't just the flavor, it was what the Coca-Cola represented. Here was proof, in liquid form, of America's casual abundance. This was not bread or meat, or fuel, things essential to survival. This was luxury, handed out without hesitation even to captured enemies. For soldiers raised in a world of scarcity and sacrifice, the impact was immediate and unsettling. In that first sip, many began to understand that the America they had been taught to scorn was far stronger, and far more confident, than they had ever imagined. For German prisoners, the strangeness of Coca-Cola was not only in its taste, but in its availability. In Germany, before the war tightened its grip, Coca-Cola had been a rare import, something seen in advertisements, or heard about in big cities. Once the conflict escalated, it vanished almost entirely, replaced by ersatz substitutes that carried none of its flavor or appeal. To most soldiers it was little more than a rumor, a symbol of American excess they would never touch. Now in American camps, it was handed out without ceremony, as though it were as common as water. Guards drank it casually with their meals, children sipped it in nearby towns, and crates of bottles seemed to appear endlessly, ready to be distributed even to enemy captives. What for Germans had once been an unimaginable luxury, was here treated as an everyday refreshment. The contrast was staggering. Men who had fought desperately for scraps of bread during the war now sat in barracks with cold bottles of Coca-Cola in their hands. The envy was undeniable, not the kind born of bitterness, but of wonder. They marveled at a society so wealthy, so overflowing with resources, that even prisoners of war were offered the luxuries once reserved for elites. In quiet conversations, many admitted that such moments shook their faith in everything they had been told. If this was decadence, then it carried with it a strength Germany could not hope to match. Coca-Cola was more than a drink, it was a lesson. In every fizzy sip, the prisoners tasted the difference between propaganda and reality. If Coca-Cola had unsettled the German prisoners, ice cream left them nearly speechless. The first time it appeared was on an ordinary afternoon in camp, when guards wheeled in tubs of vanilla and chocolate, handing out scoops in paper bowls. At first the POWs thought it must be some kind of joke. Ice cream to them was a childhood memory or a festival treat, not something anyone would expect during wartime, least of all prisoners. In Germany, dairy was rationed to the bone. Milk and cream were luxuries, often reserved for children or the sick, and sweet flavors were almost mythical by the later years of the war. To men accustomed to thin soups and dark bread, the smooth chill of ice cream felt like a dream. They stared at it, some laughing nervously, others suspicious, but once they tasted it, the disbelief turned into joy. The sweetness melted on their tongues, cold and rich, almost overwhelming after years of deprivation. The camp filled with chat. Some POWs closed their eyes to savor the taste, others marveled aloud that Americans had so much abundance, that even their prisoners could enjoy dessert. To them ice cream was more than food, it was a message. It spoke of a nation that could afford comfort even in captivity, a society so secure in its wealth and confidence that it extended kindness, even to its enemies. The moment became a memory etched deeply in their mind. Years later, many former prisoners would recall that first spoonful of ice cream as the turning point when they realized just how far America's prosperity stretched. It was sweet proof that they had entered a world entirely different from the one they had imagined. For the prisoners, Ice cream quickly became more than just a sweet taste. It turned into a symbol, a reminder of the vast difference between their homeland's scarcity and America's abundance. In Germany, every resource had been stretched thin. Families substituted margarine for butter, barley for coffee, and watery soup for full meals. Luxury items were not simply rare, they were unimaginable. Ice cream in particular belonged to a vanished world, a memory from before the war. In the camps, however, it was served as if it were nothing special. Guards and children in nearby towns enjoyed it casually, not as a luxury but as an ordinary treat. For the POWs, this casualness carried as much weight as the taste itself. It showed that America's wealth was not strained by the war. Unlike Germany, where even leaders faced shortages, the United States had so much surplus that prisoners could be given luxuries without hesitation. The awe this inspired was quiet but profound. It was not the kind of envy that stirred resentment, but the kind that forced respect. Ice cream embodied a truth that no speech or propaganda could erase. America's strength lay not only in its weapons, but in its ability to maintain normal life, to offer sweetness in the middle of a world at war. Every scoop carried a message the prisoners could not ignore, that they were seeing, tasting, and experiencing a level of prosperity their nation could not hope to match. As the days of captivity stretched into weeks, the German prisoners began to notice not just what they were given inside the camps, but also what surrounded them outside the fences. On work details or transport runs, they caught glimpses of everyday American workers, and each glimpse chipped further at the picture they had once believed about America. One of the first shocks came from the sheer number of cars. Factory workers, dock hands, even farmers seemed to own their own vehicles. To the POWs, who came from a country where cars were rare and often reserved for the elite, this sight alone spoke of staggering prosperity. Ordinary men and women, not generals or party officials, were climbing into their own automobiles at the end of the day. Boots, too, caught their attention. German soldiers knew the struggle of mending worn leather again and again. In America, by contrast, workers' boots looked sturdy, new, and often replaced without hesitation. To the prisoners, even footwear became a symbol of the gulf between scarcity and plenty. And then there were the lunches. On factory grounds or near farms, POWs saw American workers open lunch pails filled with sandwiches, fruit, meat, and thermoses of coffee. Compared to the rations their families endured back home, these meals seemed like feasts. What struck them most was the casualness of it all. Cars, boots, and lunches were not privileges. They were simply parts of everyday life. For men who had been told America was a land of weakness, these ordinary details stirred a deep sense of envy mixed with wonder. The true wealth of the nation was not hidden in vaults. It was lived out in the routines of its people. The longer the German prisoners remained in America, the more unsettling their comparisons became. What began as surprise at cars and lunches soon grew into a deeper realization. The average American worker lived in more comfort than many of Germany's elites. They remembered party officials and officers back home who struggled to keep household supplies. Even men of rank often relied on ration cards, diluted fuel, and patched clothing. Yet here in America, dock workers and farmhands lived with an ease that surpassed anything German elites could muster. Ordinary families had refrigerators humming in their kitchens, radios playing in their living rooms, and electricity that never flickered under blackout orders. The contrast was most jarring when prisoners thought of their own officers. A colonel in Germany might own a car, but here they saw shift workers driving better ones. A major's family might enjoy meat on the table once a week. Yet in America, factory families sat down to dinners of roast beef and fresh vegetables almost nightly. Even their leisure revealed the difference. Workers attended baseball games, went to movie theaters, or simply enjoyed evenings with lights on, luxuries unimaginable in war-torn Europe. The shock of this realization softened into a kind of For the first time, many POWs began to grasp the strength of democracy. A system where wealth was not locked away by a ruling class, but spread widely enough that ordinary citizens enjoyed what Germans considered luxuries. It was not arrogance that sustained America, but fairness and abundance. That truth cut deeply into their beliefs and planted a grudging admiration that no amount of propaganda could erase. One of the greatest shocks for the German prisoners came not from machines or supplies but from the people who kept them running. During supervised work trips or when they caught sight of newspaper photographs, POWs saw American factories filled with women and minorities. Images that struck directly at the heart of everything Nazi ideology had taught them. In Germany, women were urged to remain in the home, their contributions limited to raising children and supporting the war effort quietly. Factories were largely male domains, and Nazi propaganda relentlessly dismissed women as incapable of managing heavy labor or technical work. Minorities, too, were cast as inferior, unfit to share equal standing in society. To the German mind, the idea that these groups could contribute meaningfully to the war machine was unthinkable. Yet in America, here it was under women in coveralls operated lathes, pressed steel and assembled aircraft components with speed and precision. African American and immigrant workers stood at their sides, hauling materials, driving forklifts and welding ships together. The work never stopped. Shifts ran around the clock, and every set of hands, regardless of gender or background, played a role. The contradiction was jarring. How could the so-called inferior groups, whom propaganda mocked as weak or useless, be so vital in producing the very weapons and supplies defeating the Reich? It created an ideological conflict too large to ignore. Some prisoners tried to dismiss it, muttering excuses about propaganda staged for effect. But the longer they observed, the harder it became to deny. What they saw was real, a society that mobilized every citizen, turning diversity into strength. For men indoctrinated in supremacy, it was the moment when the myths they had believed began to collapse under the weight of evidence. If the workers themselves challenged Nazi ideology, the scale of their output crushed any lingering illusions of German superiority. Many POWs were eventually shown reports, photographs, or even glimpses of American factories in action. What they saw defied imagination. A single plant in Michigan produced more aircraft engines in a month than all of Germany managed in the same period. A shipyard in California launched Liberty ships so quickly that hulls seemed to roll into the water every few days. One steel mill could generate more raw material than entire German regions. The sheer volume overwhelmed the senses. For prisoners who had watched German factories struggle under shortages, bombings, and rationing, the contrast was staggering. At home, production lines often slowed to a crawl for lack of fuel, rubber, or labor. Here in America, the machines thundered day and night, fed by endless resources and an army of workers. The disbelief among the prisoners grew into awe. They whispered among themselves that no matter how bravely German soldiers fought, they could not hope to match a nation capable of such output. Numbers that once seemed like propaganda, tens of thousands of tanks, planes, and ships, now looked not only possible but inevitable. It was in these revelations that propaganda truly shattered. The German war machine, once thought unstoppable, now looked small against the industrial giant across the ocean. And the POWs realized, with a mix of dread and grudging respect, that America's strength was measured not only in soldiers but in the endless rhythm of its factory. For many prisoners, the breaking point did not come from grand factories or massive fleets, but from something far smaller: waste. In Germany, every crumb of bread, every ounce of tobacco was treasured and stretched to its limit. Families collected potato peels for soups, smoked the same cigarette down to its last shred of tobacco, and patched clothes until fabric barely held together. Scarcity defined life. In America, the contrast was unbearable. POWs saw guards toss away half-eaten sandwiches without a thought. They watched townsfolk discard apple cores, meat scraps, even loaves of bread that seemed only slightly stale. Most shocking of all were the cigarettes. German soldiers had long relied on them as prized commodities, often trading entire meals for a single one. In captivity, they saw Americans light a cigarette, take only a few puffs, and then casually flick it away. The sight was almost too much to bear. For men who had once felt pride in their endurance, this kind of casual abundance was humiliating. It was not cruelty that broke them, but generosity taken for granted. America had so much that waste itself became normal. Some prisoners confessed that these moments cut deeper than battles lost. Watching food and tobacco discarded so lightly forced them to confront the vast gulf between their homeland's desperation and America's comfort. It was a gut punch that stripped away arrogance and left behind a quiet shame. In those discarded cigarettes and wasted scraps, They saw not only the defeat of their army but the collapse of the world they had believed in. Amid the blows to their pride, the German prisoners also encountered moments that softened even the hardest heart. Christmas in captivity revealed something they had not expected: kindness. In many camps, local communities organized holiday gestures for the men behind the fences. Church choirs arrived to sing carols, their voices carrying warmth into the cold winter air. Women and children baked cookies, sometimes packaging them with small notes of goodwill. Guards themselves handed out gifts, chocolate bars, cigarettes, and to the astonishment of many, small parcels wrapped just for the occasion. For men who had braced themselves for hostility, these gestures struck deeply. The holiday in Germany had become somber, marked by shortages and fear. Families often celebrated with little more than black bread and thin soup, while the sound of air raids replaced carol. To suddenly find themselves handed sweets, listening to choirs, and treated with dignity felt almost unreal. Some prisoners wept openly, ashamed at the thought of having once called these people enemy. Others quietly tucked cookies away to save for later, savoring not only the food but the spirit behind it. The generosity carried no trace of propaganda. It was not staged for effect but offered with sincerity. In these moments a spark of redemption flickered. The POWs began to see that strength could be expressed not only in steel and ships, but in compassion. Christmas in captivity became a turning point, a reminder that even in war humanity could survive. For many, these memories endured long after the guns fell silent, etched as proof that kindness can wound pride but also heal it. The final blow to the German prisoners' belief in their nation's supremacy came when they were shown footage of the Normandy invasion. Gathered in halls or makeshift theaters, they sat in silence as reels flickered across the screen. What unfolded before them was a scale of warfare that dwarfed everything they had ever imagined. They saw row upon row of Allied ships stretching across the horizon, an endless steel armada crowding the waters off France. Landing craft surged toward the beaches in waves, each packed with soldiers. Above, squadrons of aircraft filled the skies, their shadows racing over the waves like storm clouds. Tanks rolled off landing barges, supplies poured onto the beaches, and behind it all stood a logistical force so vast that it seemed more like an unstoppable tide than a military campaign. For POWs who had been told that America was weak and fractured, the sight was overwhelming. The German military had long prided itself on precision and daring, but here was something entirely different. A demonstration of raw, coordinated power on a scale that defied comparison. Whispers spread through the rows of prisoners. Some sat with their heads bowed, others stared blankly, unable to process what they were seeing. The myth of German superiority, sustained by years of propaganda, collapsed under the weight of those images. What shook them most was not only the size of the invasion but the ease with which it seemed to unfold. The Allies had marshaled resources, so abundant that they could afford to throw them forward without hesitation. In that moment many realized the truth. Germany had not only lost battles, it had lost the war itself. If the footage of D-Day shattered illusions of German strength, what followed crushed whatever pride remained. Some POWs were confronted with evidence of the concentration camps, photographs, film reels and testimonies of what Allied soldiers had uncovered as they pushed into Germany. The images were unlike anything they had seen. Emaciated figures shuffled through barbed wire enclosures, eyes hollow with starvation. Piles of shoes and clothing testified to the lives already lost. The camera lingered on rows of unmarked graves, the silence between scenes heavier than any battlefield noise. For men who had been raised on the idea of honor in war, this revelation was unbearable. Many had dismissed rumors of atrocities as enemy propaganda. Now the truth stared back at them in undeniable detail. The empire they had fought for was not only losing, it had committed crimes so vast they could hardly comprehend them. The reaction was visceral. Some prisoners lowered their faces into their hands, unable to watch. Others sat rigid, shame etched into every line of their expression. Whispers fell away into silence. No one could offer excuses. The evidence was too clear. This was not a defeat measured in tanks or ships, but in morality. The war was no longer about borders or strategy. It was about humanity itself. And in that light, Germany's cause was not only lost but dishonored. The realization struck like a hammer, leaving the prisoners with a wound deeper than any battlefield loss. The knowledge that they had fought for a life. When the war finally ended and the prisoners were repatriated, They returned to Germany carrying memories that would linger for a lifetime. But alongside recollections of defeat and captivity, many carried stories that seemed almost unbelievable to those waiting at home. They spoke of things that had nothing to do with tanks or planes, but with small luxuries: Coca-Cola, ice cream, cigarettes, and chewing gum. To German families struggling in the ruins of bombed-out cities, these stories sounded surreal. Fathers described how guards casually handed out bottles of Coke, a drink many had never even heard of. Young men spoke of the shock of being served ice cream, not once, but regularly, in the very camps where they had expected hardship. Cigarettes, once rare and precious in Germany, were given so freely that many had too many to smoke. And then there was the chewing gum, a simple novelty that became one of the most enduring memories for those who tasted it for the first time. These tales spread quickly, whispered in kitchens, retold in markets, and passed down in families. They carried with them not just amazement but a quiet seed of hope. If America could provide such abundance even to its enemies, then perhaps there was a future where prosperity and dignity were possible for Germany too. The luxuries, though small, became powerful symbols. They marked the difference between a system built on fear and scarcity, and one built on plenty and confidence. In this way, Coca-Cola and ice cream, cigarettes, and gum became part of the post-war memory, reminders that even in captivity, humanity and abundance could shine through. In the years after the war, the stories of Coca-Cola, ice cream, cigarettes, and chewing gum outlived the camps themselves. For the former prisoners, these small luxuries became more than passing comforts. They were emblems of a system that seemed unshakable in its strength. Democracy, they realized, was not fragile or decadent as propaganda had claimed. Its power lay not only in vast factories or endless armies, but in its ability to share prosperity so widely that even captured enemies tasted. Children in post-war Germany often heard these stories at the dinner table. A father would recall his first bottle of Coke, lifting it with disbelief, as if it had been poured straight from another world. Another would speak of tasting ice cream after years of hunger, the sweetness a memory so sharp it lingered decades later. Cigarettes became a symbol of casual wealth, so abundant they were wasted. And gum, chewed and rechewed by men who had never known such a thing, became a lasting reminder of how ordinary abundance could feel extraordinary to those who had known only deprivation. These memories carried meaning beyond nostalgia. They became lessons in resilience, democracy, and dignity. The POWs who returned with such stories quietly helped reshape German attitudes toward the West. In their minds, abundance had not made Americans weak, it had made them confident, generous, and unafraid. The legacy of those small luxuries, then, was not trivial. They became markers of a hidden strength, showing that the real victory was not only in battlefield triumphs, but in proving that freedom and plenty could outlast fear and scarcity. For many, that realization offered not just closure but a path toward redemption and renewal.